I stepped off the bus into the grey London drizzle. Despite the gloomy weather and the fact that I'd forgotten my umbrella, I smiled as I hopped over a puddle. For the first time in 12 years, my every move wasn't scrutinised. I didn't have to worry about what to say or consider the consequences of every single decision I made. I was finally free. The door to Archangel Securities was as unwelcoming as it could possibly be without having a sign on it telling people to get lost. Pushing open the heavy black door, I stepped into the dimly lit interior. The reception area was empty, as usual. Not that I needed anyone to announce my arrival. I was expected. Walking into the back of the office, I pushed open the door with a sign that simply read, "The Boss," and stepped inside.
"Sam!"
My father, Sebastian Donovan, bellowed as he rose from his seat and crossed the room in 2 giant strides before pulling me into a bear hug.
"I'm so glad you stopped by. How were the new digs, sweetheart?"
he asked as he took a step back from me, a smile spreading across his face. I smiled back at him. He was always worrying about me, forever feeling guilty that he hadn't always been there. But from the moment he had come into my life after my mum died, he'd tried his hardest, and I loved him for that. He'd done the best job he could do with a stroppy teenager who was still grieving for the only parent she had ever known. I felt a pang of sadness blindside me, because it felt like that girl no longer existed now. "They're great, Dad. The office and the apartment are both perfect. Thanks for helping me find them," I replied, shaking the rain from my hair.
"Of course, love. Anything at all I can do to help, you know that. I'm just glad to have you back home where you belong, and those apartments have good security, you know,"
he replied with a wink. Archangel Securities were responsible for maintaining the CCTV equipment in my new apartment building, and they also employed the security guards that manned the front desk. Startled by a movement from the other side of the dimly lit office, I flinched instinctively. It was an old habit. I hadn't noticed anyone else in there when I'd first entered the room, but of course, he'd be there. Gabriel Sullivan and my father were business partners, and despite their 8-year age gap, the best of friends. Gabriel knew all about what had happened to me that night. Not the sanitized version from the newspapers either, but the real, awful truth. My dad had told him because they shared everything. Not for any morbid reasons, but because he'd struggled so much with what happened to me, and the fact that, despite who he was, he hadn't been able to prevent it.
"Hello, Samantha,"
Gabriel said as he stood up and walked towards me. His voice sent a shiver skittering up my spine. It had been 14 years since I'd seen this man, but if possible, he was even more handsome than I remembered. Slightly taller than my dad, and wider too. Dark hair, broad shoulders, and thick biceps, with the most incredible green eyes, and a few days' worth of stubble that accentuated his strong jawline. His presence dominated the room, and damn, that man was born to wear a suit. It seemed like a lifetime ago when I'd been a love-struck hormonal teenager who thought that she was in love with this man. But he'd always been off-limits, and I was nothing more to him than his best friend's annoying teenage daughter. I'd been 14 when I first met Gabriel. My dad brought him to the house one night while I was asleep in bed. At least, I was supposed to have been. I'd heard them come in and crept downstairs, only to be met by the sight of a shirtless demigod standing in our kitchen, with blood trickling down from his shoulder and onto his chest from what looked like a knife wound.
"Sam, get to bed,"
my dad had shouted as he came running into the kitchen, catching me standing in the shadows. "But I can help," I'd insisted, desperate to feel useful for a change. My father had looked at me and made a split-second decision as his colleague stood bleeding all over our expensive floor tiles.
"Okay, go and find me some needle and thread,"
he'd ordered. That had been my initiation into the dark and shady world that my father sometimes occupied. Gabriel had ended up with a neat scar from my dad's DIY stitching job, which he later had covered with a tattoo. And after whatever had gone on that night, the two of them set up Archangel Securities together, meaning that Gabriel became a regular feature in my life for the next 4 years.
Para seguir escuchando este audiolibro gratuitamente, haz clic en el enlace de la descripción y podrás escucharlo completo sin coste gracias a la prueba de 30 días de Audible.